and cues to stereotyping that can promote stereotype threat. There'll be a fair bit of overlap with the book, actually, Whistling Vivaldi. The research I'm going to describe is research that was covered in the book that I did largely with Claude Steele and later on with some of my own graduate students. Um, and some work that he did with some other people as well. And I want to tell you a little bit about the origin of the ideas to start out with. Um, and, I'm not going to focus a lot of time on this because he gives his own account of it in the book. Um, I'm going to give my account of it, which I think is, about 90% overlap. But there may be a few little places where we don't remember things exactly the same way. Um, but the idea, when I went to graduate school and I went to that school up north to graduate school, Claude Steele was a professor there. And he had just been at Michigan for 1 year when I came to graduate school. And I loved his work before, and that's why I wanted to go and work with him. It was actually the work that I really appreciated was research on self-affirmation theory, which is loosely related to research on stereotype threat, but only loosely so. Um, Claude, when he came to Michigan, which was just a little bit before I got there, um, be, um, spent a bunch of time focusing on mentoring minority students. And if you didn't look carefully at the picture in the book, Claude is black. He grew up in the south side of Chicago. And he spent a bunch of time mentoring minority students, both undergraduates and a few graduate students. And what he became interested in is trying to understand why these promising and talented students weren't doing as well as he expected them to do. What was going on? What was explaining that process? And thinking about his own experience and thinking about his interactions with those students gave him this idea, which he thought was novel. I think is novel, and um, is an important characterization how students can often feel. And he was particularly thinking about and looking at black students at the University of Michigan at the time, but it's actually in a feeling that we all have from time to time. When we're in a situation when we realize other people might stereotype us. And one of the examples that Claude always gave that always resonated with me, maybe partly because my family was always on the outskirts of the larger family at things like family reunions, you could have it just realizing that your particular, you know, nuclear family, um, there's a kind of a reputation about your family at a family reunion, and you may feel that people are going to view you in a certain way because there's a reputation about your family. Um, it's certainly the case. You can think of stereotypes as that same sort of reputation. You may not be doing anything. You may not think the reputation is justified. In fact, you probably don't. And this is in big contrast um, to, as we talked about in the last literature, the psychology literature often focused on thinking about members of stereotype groups as internalizing stereotypes. And we learned that people generally don't internalize stereotypes in the last lecture, but it doesn't mean that stereotypes don't have a profound and negative impact. And that's where these ideas of stereotype threat came from, recognizing that impact and what it is. Now, in the first iterations of the theory, the basic idea was when you're in a situation where you can be stereotyped, that's going to have that's going to be something you have to think about, something you have to consider, something that's going to waste your mental resources as you're working on other tasks. And although the ideas originated thinking about mentoring black students, as Claude was thinking about it, one of the things that I did as part of my dissertation was decide that I wanted to look at gender in math. Part of that was I had concerns about gender issues for a long time. Part of it was a personal story that my wife at the time, her sister was going to graduate school in math. And she was an incredibly bright woman who did phenomenally well as an undergrad. I knew her sister quite well. And she went through an experience in graduate school where she basically felt this sort of stereotype threat. And the way it showed up in her particular case is they have a qualifying exam to be a PhD candidate. And she was at the University of Washington in Seattle. And they had two parts of it. And basically everybody fails one part or the other, and then they have to redo it and redo the part they failed before they can move on to candidacy. And my wife at the time, her sister, did just like everybody else. She passed one part of the qualifying exam and she failed the other. But for her, it was just devastating. She really hadn't experienced failure in math ever in her life before that. And it made her really rethink whether she was going to continue in the program. And actually, in the end, although she is a mathematician, she left the program with a master's rather than getting her PhD. So I was thinking about her experiences at the time and the parallels between women in a math situation and blacks in a broader academic situations at a predominantly white campus. And that led us to prose the first studies we actually looked at, because it was a little easier to do the studies and recruit women who were in math to do these studies. We just simply looked at how women versus men, and we brought in people who were really talented, how women versus men performed on a math test. And we actually set up the math test so we told them half of them, these questions had shown gender differences in the past, and half of them didn't. And then we compared the performance on the two halves of the test. So we had men and women. All of them were really, really good at math. And we told them that there were gender differences or there were no gender differences on this math test. All of them were had taken Calculus 2 and gotten a B or better. All of them on either the ACT or the SAT had scored in the 90th percentile or above. All of them, had gotten, both in, all of them gotten good grades in high school. All of them were identified with math. They said they were good at math, and it was important to them that they were good at math. So they took this test, and we randomly divided half the questions. We told them there were gender differences, half we told them there wasn't. Our reasoning was that the stereotype could be applied when we were told that there were gender differences, and it can't be applied when you're told that there's no gender differences. And what we found was, so I guess I have a little more. I'm going to, I told you all of this, I'll say it again here. Everybody's highly identified with math. They took and keep in mind here, this math test is brutal. All of these people had finished Calc 2 and gotten a B or better, but we give them the advanced GRE in mathematics, which is designed for people who've completed a math major. This is a ridiculously hard test for people who've had the amount of math that they had. And we told them that it's shown gender differences in the past or it hadn't, and the dependent variable was just how they did on the test. And just telling them whether it had shown gender differences or not had a huge effect on their performance. When they were told that it had no gender differences in the past, women, which are the polka dot bars here, or the dotted bars, did just as well as men. When we told them that there were gender differences, in contrast, women really underperformed compared to men. So these studies were done. Were done just one term before the studies that were done by Steele and Aronson. After Claude moved to Stanford, he went from University of Michigan after my third year of graduate school. to Stanford. So the gender studies were done in the spring term, then, or the one I just described was done in the spring term. Then he moved to Stanford and began studies with blacks. So here we have a very similar study done with blacks and whites. To the gender studies, participants were Stanford students. Black and white students took SAT-style problems that were really, really hard, and they were described as diagnostic of ability or non-diagnostic of ability. And again, the idea was when they're described of diagnostic of ability, the stereotype is the threat in the air. When they're described as non-diagnostic of ability, that stereotype in the air should be taken away. The dependent variable was the number of the number they got right on the test on these SAT-style problems. And what you find is very parallel to what we found with gender. When the stereotype can't apply, similar to the no gender differences condition, in the non-diagnostic condition, blacks do just as well as whites. When we say the test is diagnostic, it measures ability. That's all it says, kind of standard instructions. Blacks are underperforming compared to white. What this demonstrates, it's not that these groups have less ability. It's that the situation and the fact that the stereotype can be applied is underrepresenting that ability. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture when we talk about latent ability and what that all means. But we replicate the same findings with women and men when we're looking at math, and with black and white subjects when we're looking at SAT-style questions. Okay. In study 3 in Steele and Aronson, this was a study that after we submitted the paper, the reviewers and the editors made us go back and do this study, which actually pushed us to think more about the theory. And during this time, particularly Claude developed what he called the double consciousness hypothesis. What is it about that threat being in the air? What is it that causes problems for your actual performance? So yes, you have to think about and you deal with the stereotype, but what he argued is both at the same time, when that threat is in the air, you have to be vigilant for that stereotype. You have to be on the lookout for it potentially being there as something that could affect how people are evaluating you. But at the same time, just like that person-group discrimination discrepancy we saw in the last lecture, you don't want to think that that stereotype is going to be affecting you in this situation. So you're vigilant for the stereotype, but you want to avoid thinking about the stereotype at the same time. And the idea is that's going to take a tremendous amount of mental energy to do both those things. You're going to have the stereotype activated, you're going to be looking for it. At the same time, you're going to want to deny its significance for you personally. So this was, again, Stanford participants. We had black and white students, and they were shown a difficult problem. Here they were just shown a problem from the test, and they weren't actually asked to do it. They just were given a sample problem. And the test was either described as diagnostic ability or non-diagnostic of ability. There's also a control condition where they just answered the questions not thinking they're going to take the test at all. The dependent variables here were stereotype activation. And the way they measured that was, and this was state of the art then, it's definitely not now, where you have people complete various words that could be completed with stereotypes about blacks. So you could have VIO. Now, you could complete that violent, which would be consistent with the stereotype of blacks. Or you could complete that violin, which wouldn't be. So there were a number of these word stems, beginnings of words that they had to complete with a word. And the idea is if you're activating the stereotype, you'll complete more of those words with stereotypic words. That's the measure of stereotype activation. And then what Steele and Aronson called stereotype avoidance. And this is how much people describe themselves as being interested in things that are stereotypically black. And it included all kinds of things like, do you like basketball? Do you like hip hop music? And what the idea would be is that when people are worried about this threat in the air, they're going to activate the stereotype on the stereotype activation measure, and they're going to describe themselves in ways that are less stereotypically black. So you'll have this double consciousness. You're vigilant for the stereotyping. At the same time, you're denying the stereotype is relevant in your personal life. So if we look at the stereotype activation measure, you see a very clear activation of the stereotype in the diagnostic condition where stereotype threat would be high. Lot more words completed with things consistent with the black stereotype. That's not true in the non-diagnostic condition, and it's not true if you don't say anything about the test, just have them come in and fill out the measures. There's that data where you see in the diagnostic condition many more stereotypic completions. Let's look at stereotype avoidance. How much do you describe stereotypic things as characteristic of you? Do you like basketball? Do you like hip hop music, etc.? And you see very clear stereotype avoidance amongst blacks in the diagnostic condition. Notice in the non-diagnostic condition, and if they just ask people the questionnaire without thinking about the test, they actually describe themselves a tiny bit more in stereotypic ways. They do like basketball a little more than whites. They do like hip-hop music a little more than whites, but that's not true in the they don't describe themselves that same way in the non-diagnostic condition. Okay. Now, study 4 for Steele and Aronson was an interesting one that shows how easy the stereotype can rear its head. So again, these were participants from Stanford. They were black and white students who took the SAT problems that were described as non-diagnostic. In this case, you would expect no gender or no race differences when the test is described as non-diagnostic of ability. But how easily can that stereotype be raised as a possibility that could interfere with their performance? All they did in this experiment, in one condition, they had people check off their race from a list of, and the list was kind of the standard, really run-of-the-mill. People listed, are you black, are you white, are you Latino, in those days it probably would have been Hispanic, and are you Native American or other? So people ticked off the race or not. So you made people think about their race or not, and the idea is this is enough to raise the stereotype as a concern, even in a non-diagnostic test where you don't normally see differences in performance. Here you're going to see them, but only if you've ticked off the race before you start. So they were either primed with their race, they indicated their race at the beginning of the questionnaire or not, and the dependent variables, again, the number right on the test. And what you see is when they ticked off their race, they're doing worse than whites, but without doing that, they're doing just as well as whites in this particular test. So that's what you see there. So in this first round of research, really what we demonstrated was an effect. We demonstrated that when stereotypes are a possible explanation of performance, members of stereotype groups do worse. And when you take away that as a possible explanation of performance, you see people's ability to actually show forth, and they're able to do as well as whatever group you're comparing them to. We also did, at this time, an intervention for stereotype threat, looking at improving students' grades. And this was conducted at Michigan, and it was conducted for 2 years before Claude left and then a couple years after when he was at Stanford. It was in a particular dorm. We highlighted that students were admitted because they were talented. And we actually took everybody who was admitted to the University of Michigan, but it really is a selective university, just like Ohio State. So you are